Welcome to the Dyslexia Training for Parents for Itasca Independent School District. Let's start by talking about some characteristics of dyslexia and related disorders. The Texas Education Code defines dyslexia as a disorder of constitutional origin manifested by a difficulty in learning to read, write, or spell, despite conventional instruction, adequate intelligence, and sociocultural opportunity. This means that the student that has the dyslexia disorder was typically born with it, and it shows itself in a difficulty to learn to read, write, or spell, despite having adequate intelligence and an adequate access to learning. The Texas Dyslexia Handbook further clarifies characteristics of dyslexia as a difficulty in reading words in isolation, accurately decoding unfamiliar words, difficulty with oral reading, and difficulty with spelling. A student that has dyslexia may not necessarily demonstrate all of those characteristics. They may just have a combination of some of them. It's not required to have all of the characteristics to be identified as dyslexic. Some consequences of dyslexia could include difficulty with reading comprehension, so not understanding what a student has read, difficulty with written language, struggling to get words onto paper, to write full sentences, to write paragraphs, and then a limited vocabulary growth because of the reduced reading experiences. A student who's not reading as much as their peers, typically their vocabulary growth is not going to be on level with what their peers are. Students are typically showing, they show average growth in other areas. So a student with dyslexia who has adequate intelligence is growing in math and science and social studies and showing average growth on par with their peers in those areas. So all students in the state of Texas are tested, they're screened for dyslexia in kindergarten by the end of the school year. This gives kindergartners a chance to have a full year of growth in kindergarten and a chance to learn their letters and their sounds. And then again in first grade, students in Texas are screened by the end of January. And this gives us a chance to have the students back after summer and have a full semester worth of growth if they're behind before we screen them again. The screener, it's not a formal evaluation. It's not a sole deciding factor to assess for dyslexia. It is just a screener and just gives us information on who might be at risk for dyslexia. This information is valuable in allowing us to begin interventions for students who potentially aren't already being in an intervention for reading. Also, the information from the screener, along with classroom data, their intervention information if they are in intervention, and then teacher information would determine the next steps with each individual student. If the screener information or just information from the classroom has determined that the student is highly at risk of having dyslexia, a committee is typically formed. This committee typically would have the principal, a dyslexia specialist, a teacher, parent as members. These are not required members. These are, but this would be what the typical committee would be comprised of. This committee would come together and discuss the need for additional testing and seek parent consent if they decided if the need for testing is present. Once that committee has identified the need, then the following tests are typically administered. This is a standard battery of tests that a dyslexia specialist would use. This is not the only test that can be used. There are many out there, but here at Itasca ISD, this is what we typically will assess a student with to determine their identification of dyslexia. So a test of written spelling, which would test for spelling difficulties. The Gray Oral Reading Test 5, test for reading comprehension and fluency. How well they comprehend or understand the information the readings that they've read, or the fluency is how smooth and fast a student reads. The comprehensive test of phonological processing would test for phonological processing abilities related to reading, so sounding out words, being able to understand and know different sounds of phonemes. And then the Woodcock Reading Mastery Test, which measures for reading readiness and achievement. A qualified dyslexia evaluator would look at that data that was gathered by the team, and it would include parent information on the student, how the student progressed through normal milestones, and if any family information, including dyslexia, was present. Teacher information is important. Student work would be looked at. The dyslexia screeners that were done. Any intervention data, such as is the student in intervention, and if so, have they been progressing through what they've been learning? And then the assessments above that were given, and the dyslexia evaluator would come to a recommendation to the team. The team would reconvene to determine, does that student qualify as dyslexic? And if they do, the team would move forward into placing that student into Section 504 or special education. It would depend on the student's need. So eligibility is determined by the full committee. It's not one individual. Even though the dyslexia assessor performs the test and looks at the data and makes a recommendation, it is up to the full team to determine the next steps and whether or not the student actually qualifies as dyslexic. The committee looks at multiple sources of data, including classwork, the dyslexia assessments, and the evaluator's determination based on those, parent information, teacher information, any intervention progress, and map testing data. If you feel your student may have dyslexia, please reach out to your student's teacher or principal. If your student is currently serviced through dyslexia, but you feel updates to the plan are needed, you would want to reach out to your teacher's student or your student's teacher or principal also. Some effective strategies for teaching students with dyslexia. Dyslexia students receive standard protocol dyslexia instruction. This is given in a small group setting. It is a focused reading intervention based on the identified areas of need. It addresses the following areas: phonological awareness, sound and symbol association, syllabication, orthography, morphology, syntax, reading comprehension, and reading fluency. The standard protocol dyslexia instruction, it is standard. It's not individualized per student. Each student is going to receive a standard amount of that instruction. At Itasca Elementary, typically 120 minutes per week is what dyslexia students receive of the standard protocol dyslexia instruction. At the middle school, it's 60 minutes per week, and at the high school, it's 30 minutes per week. Qualifications of staff that serve dyslexia students. The staff that serve the standard protocol dyslexia instruction are highly qualified and certified teachers. They also go through additional training specifically in dyslexia instruction to be able to adequately provide that standard protocol dyslexia instruction. They are specifically trained in that to provide those services. All Itasca ISD staff members that work with students are trained on dyslexia identification and the basics of dyslexia. Some accommodations for dyslexia students. Each student that is identified as dyslexia is serviced through either Section 504 or through special education. This is dependent on the student's needs. If a student has dyslexia and is able to be adequately served through some accommodations and the standard protocol dyslexia instruction, then the student is probably serviced through Section 504. If they have more individualized needs and need additional specialized instruction, then a student is serviced through special education. Some accommodations that are often needed and written into individualized plans, whether they're in Section 504 or special education, each student would have an individualized plan based on that student's needs. Each student's plan is different. Some common accommodations that potentially could be given are oral administration of tests and assignments, extra time for reading, spelling assistance, So for more information, you could, Texas has a Texas Dyslexia Handbook. I will have it linked in the handout for this presentation. Or you can do a Google search for Texas Dyslexia Handbook and read through, and it has the requirements for school districts based on Texas state law. Feel free to contact your child's campus for more information regarding dyslexia services, evaluation, or instruction. Your student's teacher or principal will be happy to help you at any time.